Welcome to part 9 of the New South and the Wild West. Now we're going to take a look at the Transcontinental Railroad. In 1862, during the Civil War, Congress passed the Pacific Railroad Act, which chartered two railroad companies, the Central Pacific Railroad and the Union Pacific Railroad, to build a transcontinental railroad linking the East and the West, right? The Central Pacific Railroad will begin building in Sacramento and work itself eastward, crossing the Sierra Nevada mountains and ultimately ending up in Utah. Meanwhile, the Union Pacific Railroad was to begin in the east and work westward, beginning in Omaha, Nebraska, and finally ending up meeting up with the Central Pacific Railroad in Utah at a place called Promontory Summit. And it'll be there that on May 10th, 1869, that the two railroads will meet. A ceremonial golden spike will be driven into the ground, and you have a transportation link by rail that links the east coast of the United States to the west, right? From there, railroads are going to continue to just explode in every direction, even in the west. In the 1880s and 1890s, 25% of all timber production in the United States went for railroad development, right? The Eastern industrialists lost interest in the Western railroads after the Transcontinental Railroad was done, but that void was filled by people like James J. Hill, who was a Westerner who began developing these railroads as a means to control the economies in the regions and create what were called geographic monopolies, something we'll talk about later, right? One of the biggest problems that comes about by having these railroads that span the entire continent was time. Time was always very difficult for a couple of reasons. One, you got to be able to know what time something's going to arrive somewhere for you to appropriately assign freight rates to it, right? So you need to be able to tell your client, your customer, saying, all right, I put this on this rail car and it's going to arrive on noon on the 25th in San Diego. But you got to know what time it is in San Diego. Now, the way that they would tell time typically was, well, you looked at the sky, right? How do you set your clock in your town? Well, you set it by when it was high noon. Why do they call it high noon? That's when the sun is directly above your head. You set your clock to that. Now it's noon. Everybody synchronizes off the town clock. Okay, that's great for a town, but if it's high noon in Fort Worth, what time is it in Santa Fe? I mean, today we know it's 11 o'clock in Santa Fe, but we set our clocks here in Fort Worth by looking at the sun at high noon. When Santa Fe, they went and did the same thing. That could only be 38 minutes different from each other. Now, the other issue with not knowing time, aside from freight rates, is safety. A lot of these rails crossing the country are single rails. And the last thing you want to do, because you don't know what time trains are being on what tracks when, is the last thing you want is to have a westbound train going 60 miles per hour heading towards an eastbound train going 70 miles per hour, because then it becomes an algebra equation, right? If a westbound train going 60 miles per hour hits an eastbound train going 70 miles per hour, what's the consistency of pate that the passengers become when the two come together? You got to know what train is on what track at what time. And so the railroads come up with a solution. They establish time zones, right? They'll use the telegraph to be able to synchronize it, and then you have, in at least the continental United States, 4 established time zones, and then you make sure that this way you know what time it is in Santa Fe and what time it is in Fort Worth at any given time, and you can coordinate your freight rates and you can coordinate the safety of the trains by using these techniques. Now, this building of the Transcontinental Railroad is actually going to lead to some of the growing resistance against immigration in the United States as well, specifically where the railroad was being built from the west. You had a large influx of Chinese nationals that immigrated into the west coast of the United States during the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. This was referred to as the coolie trade. Don't use that word. It's not a nice word to use. That's just what they called that, okay? This was basically a trade in which Chinese men would come to the United States and sell themselves into as contract laborers. It's effectively a form of indentured servitude. Matter of fact, women would also come over from China and sell themselves typically into the sex trade in the same region, right? So between 1840 and 1870, the Chinese contracted and immigrated into California and also in other places. They also were the same thing was happening in Australia, Southeast Asia, Peru, even Cuba, right? Chinese immigrants would move into regions and form Chinatowns, and they tend to coalesce together, and it would begin to cause some resentment, in which people started saying, "Hey, these people are taking jobs away from Americans." That probably sounds like a pretty familiar argument to y'all. And began pushing back for some kind of limitation on Chinese immigration, right? The Chinese were known as very cheap laborers, and matter of fact, by the 1880s, 50% of full-time agriculture work in California was done by Chinese, and they also dominated about 90% of the service industry. Again, I know we talk about the stereotypical Chinese laundry. Well, it was a reality during that time period, right? So in 1882, Congress is going to pass its first ever immigration restriction laws, called the Chinese Exclusion Act. Now, the Chinese Exclusion Act placed a 10-year moratorium on all Chinese labor immigration. Non-labor immigrants had to get a permit from the Chinese government stating that they were not laborers, which was not easy to do. How do you make an argument that you are not a laborer, right? The moratorium was only 10 years, though, right? 10 years later, though, in 1892, you'll have the passage of the Geary Act. The Geary Act took the Chinese Exclusion Act and extended it another 10 years. And then finally, in 1902, it will be made permanent. This is just the first example of efforts to try and limit immigration. Something when we take a look at urbanization on the East Coast, we'll see will eventually lead into other forms of immigration restrictions, some of them with some pretty dire consequences.